ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Kindly please take your seats. Your safety is our utmost priority, and so before we get into the proceedings this morning, I'd like to welcome Mr. Hendrik Swart, who is the safety officer from Gallagher Estate, to come and give us a very brief safety briefing that we will adhere to over the next 2 days. Hendrik, please won't you join me?
Morning, everyone. Welcome to Gallagher. Just a quick safety briefing. We start off, there's no smoking allowed in the halls, especially in the ladies and gents toilets. Ladies and gents toilets is situated to the northern side of the hall, towards the back of the hall, and on your right-hand side of the escalators. Smoking area is downstairs of the escalators, outside the lower lobby. In case of emergency, a siren will sound. Fire marshal will announce the emergency, and on his instruction will evacuate the hall. Fire marshals will wear yellow reflector jackets, and they will lead us to assembly points. There is 4 fire escapes to the southern side of the hall, which is to the back of the stage, which leads directly to the assembly point. The assembly point is situated next to Gallagher Avenue. In case of emergency, call the security on 011 266 3206. In case of any medical emergency, the medical room is situated to the left side of the hall, next to the main 2 glass doors. Enjoy your day.
Thank you very much, Hendrik. Now, ladies and gentlemen, into the order of today. As we all know, the Gauteng Infrastructure and Investment Conference in 2015 laid the foundation to deepen and to broaden engagement between the private and the public sector, as they all rallied around the ideal of increasing investment not only into this particular city region, but also increasing investment and investment flows between the continent and other city regions that are on the African continent. And so today, ladies and gentlemen, as we deliberate and as we discuss and as we debate over the next 2 days, it's going to be building on the momentum that started in 2015. And so we're here today not only to reflect back and assess how well we've done since 2015, but also to review the journey ahead, what needs to be done differently in order for us to find the right financing instruments, the right investment streams, and to bolster these on the right partnerships between the public and the private sector, especially given the economic climate of the day. And so for our official opening ceremony, it gives me great pleasure to welcome and to join me on the podium this morning. I'm going to ask that MEC Lebogang Maile to please join us, the MEC for Economic Development in the Gauteng Province. I'm also going to ask that the Premier of the Gauteng Province, Premier David Makura, to please join me on stage. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm also going to call on Minister Patel, Minister of Economic Development, to also join me on stage. And as they take the stage, ladies and gentlemen, we will be getting their insights and their thoughts around why we are here today, giving us the purpose of the conference, but also scoping the conversations that we're going to be having. Later on today, ladies and gentlemen, once we have had our official opening, we're going to be transitioning into our panel discussions for the day. Now, there are 2 important focuses for our panel discussions today. We're going to be looking at, in our first panel, how do we find new and emerging investment sources from the public and the private sector? And in the second panel discussion, we're going to be looking at how do we sustain investment at a time when the economy is weak. And in all of this, ladies and gentlemen, your voices, your insights, your contributions are key. And so we will invite you to contribute through a facilitated question and answer session. For now, though, to give us his official welcoming remarks and to underscore the purpose of this conference, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome the MEC for Economic Development in the Gauteng Province, Mr. Lebogang Maile.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Let me observe protocol by acknowledging the presence of our Honorable Premier, the presence of the Honorable Minister of Economic Development, Minister Patel, the members of the Executive Council, the provincial government, the president of SALGA, and I think UCLG, Mr. Pax Mpotau. Let me also acknowledge Your Excellencies, the various High Commissioners and Ambassadors who are present here today, the representatives of the Governor of Lagos who are with us here today, the members of the provincial legislature, various executive mayors, members of the mayoral committees, councillors, senior management of government from different levels, different agencies, led by the Director General who are here today, business leaders and captains of industries, distinguished guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I've been asked to welcome you, so you are all welcome. But perhaps it's proper just to say just a few things, because the Premier is going to speak on behalf of the provincial government. And I think one of the things we want to say, and it's a point that we all know, it's that the current political and economic environment in our country, it's not a pretty one, and we all know that we are faced with a number of challenges, and these challenges are affecting economic growth, and they are also affecting our performance as a country. And we all know that the business fixed investment continues to contract, consumer spending is falling, and the economy is in a technical recession. I think Minister Patel will speak further on this matter, because I had the Premier asking him if we are still on a technical recession. So I think he will speak further on this matter. And we all know that this is not good for our economy. And despite the fact that the global economy has grown around 3% and is on an upward trajectory, in order to turn things around, the reality is that we need to play our role as government in restoring confidence in the economy and removing uncertainties in order to boost investment in our economy. Without buy-in from the private sector and other relevant stakeholders like labor, we won't be able to turn our economic fortunes around and deliver on our program of radical transformation, modernization, and reindustrialization as the provincial government. So it is within this context that we are coming together for the Gauteng Infrastructure Investment Conference, which is significant in turning around the economic fortunes of our country. And although this is not going to be an event, it's a process. But we think that this engagement is very important for us as a province, which contributes significantly to the economy of the province, of the country and the continent. And we know by now, because this was said in the last infrastructure investment conference, that Gauteng needs about 1.8 trillion for infrastructure investment over the next 15 years. And we are planning to spend at least 45 billion over the next MTF on infrastructure as the provincial government in order to kickstart the economy. And it is clear that this is not enough. We need more. And that is why we are here today to engage with yourselves. We want to use infrastructure investment to contribute to economic empowerment, to economic transformation, improving quality of life, as well as enhancing the global competitiveness of our economy. And we also know, and I think Minister Patel will be speaking in detail on this issue, that there is utilized at the national level. We want to boost investment in the various industrial sectors with world-class infrastructure. For us, investing in infrastructure, maintaining existing infrastructure, as well as building new infrastructure is the lifeblood of our social and economic transformation agenda. Hence, this conference has been convened to mobilize more resources across the private and public sectors so that we can enhance the social well-being of our people and expand economic opportunities to all by pulling together to invest in our economy through building strategic and catalytic economic and industrial infrastructure. As I conclude, Program Director, we are confident that as we come together in order to chart a collective path forward and identify specific opportunities for investment and development within Gauteng, we will indeed be able to move our city region's economy forward and make the necessary gains in order to give our people the better life that we all aspire to. So with those few words, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take this opportunity to welcome you on behalf of the provincial government. Thank you very much.
A very big thank you to MEC Lebogang Maile, and of course underscoring the context that we're in today. 1.8 trillion rands, that is the funding financing need that there is. And at a time where we're seeing private sector fixed investment at 60%, ladies and gentlemen, reminding you of course that at its peak in 2006, private sector fixed investment was sitting at 75%. And so we're seeing the trajectory that's being painted is showing, as he described it in his own words, the picture is not looking too pretty. Now, before I call on the Premier, ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to please bring to your attention, for those who are struggling to find seats, there is ample seating in the front. Please make your way to the front. There's ample seating right on my right-hand side, so please make sure that you can join us here. Also know, ladies and gentlemen, that we do have free Wi-Fi available today. It's called GIIC 2017. So if you would like to tweet and you would like the world to know about the conversations that we're having here today, you're more than welcome to use the Wi-Fi, and please use the same hashtag GIIC 2017. Let's let the world know how the Gauteng City region is looking at new ways of spurring investment despite the economic environment. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd also like to bring to your attention a short video that we're going to share with you now. And this video, ladies and gentlemen, really seeks to profile the work that the Gauteng City region, which is responsible for about 35% of the national GDP, the Gauteng City region's contribution to building and enhancing the economic muscle of the country. Please take a look.
Gauteng, South Africa's economic powerhouse, leads the way in investment, manufacturing, technology, research and innovation. 5 regions seamlessly collaborate to form a harmonious economic relationship, making Gauteng an integrated city region. Gauteng contributes 34% of South Africa's GDP, as well as 10% to Africa's GDP. The provincial economy attracts the largest share of South Africa's FDI inflows and also accounts for the largest exports. Most multinational companies doing business in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa have their headquarters in Gauteng and call it their home. All major financial and telecommunication companies are based in Gauteng. Gauteng boasts a modern transport infrastructure, in which air, rail and road effortlessly connect, making it the gateway to Africa. It is home to Africa's largest and busiest airport, the OR Tambo International Airport. Despite being landlocked, Gauteng prides itself in having the largest inland port in Africa, making it the continent's pulse of connectivity. Pursuant to its commitment towards radical transformation, modernization and reindustrialization, Gauteng is experiencing major spatial and economic transformation. A new economic plan aims to increase employment and economic inclusion by focusing on the following key sectors: manufacturing, services, mining, agriculture, infrastructure development, creative and cultural industries. Research and development has a crucial role in the growth of the economy. Gauteng boasts the highest concentration of research and academic institutions, bolstering its capacity for innovation. Gauteng's prowess and towering ambitions are also evident in its successful hosting of high-profile sporting, cultural and entertainment events. Gauteng is strategically poised to offer a unique hosting experience. Great moments are staged here. Like leading city regions in the world, modern-day Gauteng is the melting pot of cultures. It is a place where people from all walks of life can celebrate their dreams and realize their ambitions. This is a place where people live, work and play. Gauteng, it starts here.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the Premier of the Gauteng Province, Mr. David Makhura.
Thank you very much to our program director, Nozipho Mbanjo, the Minister of Economic Development in our country, Honorable Ibrahim Patel, members of the Executive Council and Executive Mayors, the President of the United Cities and Local Government, Councillor Pax Dau, ambassadors and high commissioners, the delegation from the state of Lagos in Nigeria, which is attending this conference, representatives of regional and city governments from other parts of our continent, business leaders, investors, entrepreneurs, leaders of trade unions and civil society organizations, researchers, policymakers, academics, distinguished participants, and fellow Africans. I would like to join MEC Lebogang Maile in welcoming you all to the 2017 Gauteng Infrastructure Investment Conference. As you are aware, this is the second biennial conference convened by the Gauteng Provincial Government in order to showcase a full portfolio of our provincial infrastructure projects so that we can solicit private sector partnership and mobilize other resources of funding for infrastructure in our province. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no doubt that world-class infrastructure contributes significantly to the quality of life of citizens, as well as the competitiveness and attractiveness of countries, regions, and cities. The state-of-the-art infrastructure also serves as the veins and arteries of any modern economy and any prosperous society. Sustained investment in public infrastructure also serves as a stimulus to growth, employment creation, spatial transformation, and social integration by connecting communities and linking producers to markets. It's on this basis that infrastructure investment is among the top priorities of our provincial government's program for transformation, modernization, and reindustrialization of our Gauteng City region in line with South Africa's National Development Plan, Vision 2030. We meet at a time in our country when the economy is in technical recession. Our sovereign rating has also been downgraded. We therefore need major interventions, both institutionally as well as the policy environment, to reignite growth, particularly inclusive growth. Over many decades, infrastructure development and investment has played a major role as a stimulus for growth in many countries. As the economic engine of our country, the Gauteng City region must take a lead in turning around the performance of our economy and in improving South Africa's economic fortunes. We must take a lead now as social partners, government, business, and labor working together. There is no doubt, because of the size of the economy of our province, that if Gauteng works better, 35% of South Africa's economy will be working, and the impact will be huge. This question of infrastructure investment is very important. Even in our recent history, there's evidence that infrastructure investment has had a huge impact in improving the quality of life of citizens and in improving the performance of our economy. Between 2013 and 2016, the Gauteng provincial government has invested 30 billion rand in infrastructure development. This is the largest rate of investment in infrastructure by any provincial authority in our republic. A KPMG study has demonstrated that the 30 billion rand infrastructure investment has contributed to the creation of 92,000 direct jobs into the Gauteng economy. This investment has also contributed 15 billion rands to support household incomes. The investment has further contributed 6 billion rands to government revenue. It has also generated additional economic activity of 26 billion rands in the Gauteng provincial economy. The study further indicates that for every 1 rand spent on infrastructure, an additional 92 cents are added to the Gauteng economy. Further infrastructure spend is also supporting some of our major objectives of economic transformation. For example, in Gauteng province, through infrastructure development, we have been able to contribute to Black economic empowerment and the inclusion of those who have been previously excluded in the mainstream of our economy. In this regard, 91% of our infrastructure spend goes to Black-owned companies, especially in the infrastructure and construction space. In the next 3 years, the Gauteng provincial government will spend 42 billion rands on infrastructure development, whilst the municipalities in our province will spend 95 billion rands. All this is to contribute to building our social and economic infrastructure. As we speak and as we gather here, Gauteng has a total of 412 active infrastructure projects, which are worth more than 200 billion rands, and these projects are on our infrastructure monitor. And they are at various stages of development, most of them funded from the fiscus, but some of them from private sector sources of funding. The 3-year envisaged infrastructure investment I've just referred to will contribute about 55 billion rands into the Gauteng economy. It will also create 190,000 direct jobs and 140,000 indirect jobs through creating other economic activities. This infrastructure spend will also contribute 12.4 billion rands to government revenue and add another 31 billion rands to household income. So all these infrastructure projects I've referred to are part of our 15-year infrastructure master plan, which the MEC has also referred to. Excuse me, I've got some flu, Program Director. I hope everyone is not as sick as I am in this conference. As I've said, all the infrastructure, the 412 infrastructure projects I referred to are part of Gauteng City Region's 15-year infrastructure master plan, which the MEC has referred to, which will cost us 1.8 trillion rands. So as things stand, we spend about 200 million rands per annum. So we have a 1.6 trillion rands deficit going forward. And these are real infrastructure requirements for a modern economy and a prosperous province. The infrastructure master plan I've referred to is truly the backbone of our vision of building Gauteng into a globally competitive city region as a sub-national economy, a city region that is seamlessly integrated spatially, that is economically inclusive, that's also underpinned by social cohesion. A sub-national economy that's a dynamic African city region which is at the cutting edge of Africa's fourth industrial revolution. An economy which is underpinned by smart, green, innovation-driven and knowledge-based industries. Our province is a significant player, not only in the South African economy. We are also a significant player in the economy of our entire continent. We contribute between 8 and 10% to Africa's GDP. Together with the state of Lagos, we are the 6th largest economies in Africa, bigger than 49 of the 54 national economies in our continent. One of the good stories is that the Lagos state is here. So we and Lagos, there are only 5 national economies that are bigger than Gauteng and Lagos state. And the rest of the 49 national economies are much smaller than Lagos state and Gauteng's economy. In addition, Gauteng is the financial nerve center as well as the technological, industrial, and advanced manufacturing hub of sub-Saharan Africa. Due to the competitiveness of our infrastructure, we're a major destination for foreign direct investment and business tourism from across the world and our continent. According to a report by FDI Intelligence magazine, between 2011 and 2016, Gauteng attracted a total of 460 FDI projects worth 150 billion rands into this economy. Let me take this opportunity to convey a special word of welcome to the delegation from Lagos State in Nigeria. And I would like to say to the conference, in September, the governor of Lagos, Governor Ambode, will be visiting our province to sign a memorandum of cooperation between Gauteng and Lagos State this September. These 2 sub-national economies are key drivers of Africa's industrialization and major centers of innovation. We are also the 2 most cosmopolitan regions, and indeed Afropolitan city regions in our continent. And once more, welcome the delegation from Lagos State. Let's give them a big round of applause. If there are subnational governments to watch in our continent, watch what happens in Gauteng and what happens in Lagos over the next 10 years. This year's conference will also pay special attention on infrastructure challenges and investment opportunities in our continent. Africa's infrastructure deficit per annum is worth $100 billion. And this challenge is a golden opportunity for African investors, developers, construction companies, and professional services firms. It is estimated that 645 million people in sub-Saharan Africa have no access to reliable energy and clean water. Only a third of rural dwellers live within 2 kilometers of a proper road, compared with 2/3 in developing countries. Travel and communication within our continent is more expensive and cumbersome than travel and communication between Africa and the rest of the world. We know that infrastructure investment also plays a central role in integrating the economies of our continent as well as the markets. It improves connectivity as well as facilitate the movement of goods and services and people across the borders. Economists estimate that 1 percentage point increase in infrastructure investment will raise Africa's GDP by 1.3% and raise employment by 0.7%. The conference will explore more details about Africa's prospects and opportunities, especially tomorrow. For us in Gauteng, our infrastructure story is increasingly being told not only by government and business people, but this is a story our own citizens are telling themselves. In the last Gauteng City Region Observatory's Quality of Life survey released in July last year, infrastructure achieved the highest rating by citizens in Gauteng, a rating of 80%. There's no other government service, there's no other area of government performance where the residents in Gauteng are as satisfied as they are about the quality of infrastructure in our province. So this is a story not from government, this is a story from our own citizens. It is important that as we tackle all these challenges, we also get feedback from citizens from the GCRO Quality of Life survey, and that it is indeed true that 92% of our citizens have access to piped water, and many of them say that they are quite satisfied with access to water. But they are concerned about the cost of water as well as the future water security. With regard to sanitation, 91% of our residents have access to decent sanitation, and they are satisfied with that. Electricity, 90% of our residents have access to reliable electricity. They are worried about the increase in the cost of electricity. With regard to refuse removal on a weekly basis, 88% of our residents are happy with this. And formal housing, 86% of our residents are happy and satisfied with access to formal housing, regardless of the challenge of rapid migration and urbanization. With regard to household internet connectivity, we are at 65%. So we still have a long journey to go, because connectivity today is as important as having access to public transport, to water, to electricity. It's the lifeblood of any modern economy. Despite the challenges of immigration and rapid urbanization, People of our province are also very satisfied with the quality of educational infrastructure and our performance in education. Where are the major problems? However, access to reliable public transport and mobility remains one of the major problems experienced by residents in Gauteng. Access to healthcare also remains on our radar screen, as increasingly many of our residents are dissatisfied with access to healthcare. We also need to pay greater attention to investing in economic infrastructure, particularly industrial infrastructure in all the 5 development corridors of our province, in line with the major priority sectors of our provincial economic development plan. So this question of investing in economic infrastructure is something that must receive our increasing attention. We count amongst the progress we are making in the infrastructure, such as the one we are putting also in our townships, in the expansion of the Gauteng Innovation Hub, which is currently underway, the building of the jewelry manufacturing precinct at the OR Tambo International Airport, IDZ, the refurbishment of Township Industrial Hub, and the construction of agri-parks in different regions, especially in the West Rand and Sidibeng, the establishment of EKASI labs for technology startups in our townships, especially for our youth. We are rolling out more than 1,500 kilometers of fiber across the province, connected to 8 core sites, and there are 800 access sites of Gauteng broadband network in different areas of our province. We're hoping by the end of 2019, we will reach our target of 3,000 connected sites across the Gauteng city region. With regard to the modernization of public transport, the Gautrain is one of the major sources of pride in our infrastructure investment. We are now procuring additional stock for the Gautrain, but even more importantly, we want to expand the routes of the Gautrain to different parts of our province. Of course, we can only do this with the partnership of the private sector. The amount of money required is too much for government to can afford. We're also building new logistics hubs and new highways in Sidibeng and the West Rand, as well as the areas that are parts of the erythropolis in our province, Ekurhuleni, Tshwane, and Johannesburg, where we have the footprints of the Gauteng erythropolis. On human settlements, our province has delivered most houses in the past since 1994, a total of 1.2 million houses, accounting for 31% of the national housing stock. We know the major challenge remains that we have a huge housing backlog, which this housing backlog itself is an opportunity for investment by private sector players, including developers, who must join us in our mega human settlement housing delivery. Our province currently has been able to provide housing to 4.9 million Gauteng residents in our province. In order to respond to the high levels of in-migration, we are implementing what we call the mega human settlement housing delivery and the development of post-apartheid cities. To date, there are 18 mega human settlement projects that have achieved technical readiness status, of which 12 are planned for implementation in the run-up to the end of our term in 2019. Since 2014, we have built 19 new schools, which many of these schools have the state-of-the-art ICT infrastructure. This is something also very important in our social infrastructure investment story, the modernization of public education in Gauteng province. And this, I must say, ladies and gentlemen, we think we are the leader in our continent in turning around and modernizing public education to prepare our kids for the fourth industrial revolution. As we implement our infrastructure programs, we have also been very deliberate in ensuring that these programs are linked to economic transformation and the empowerment of those of our citizens who have been excluded previously, as well as the localization and stimulation of manufacturing capacity in our province. This is part of our agenda for radical economic transformation. I would like to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, by focusing on the following issues. And these are the issues that often undermine infrastructure delivery and hamper the progress on investment in infrastructure. The first issue is inadequate budgets. One of the reasons, and the primary reason we have convened this conference, is that government doesn't have enough money to can meet these infrastructure requirements. Government will never have enough money to meet all the infrastructure requirements of today and tomorrow of our modern economy and developing society. Public-private partnerships are therefore very important, and they are the way to go. It is for this reason that we have this summit, to mobilize off-budget resources to meet our infrastructure needs. However, and this we know from experience, that the private sector needs an enabling environment to be created so that they can participate in opportunities for infrastructure investment. And of course, they must get their return on investment. This we know. We know that it is not out of good heart that the private sector comes in this. It is out of purpose. Private sector, for the private sector to partner or participate in an infrastructure project, there must be a return on investment. And this we understand. And this we want certainly to ensure that there is a return on investment. And the participation of the private sector is often hampered by the second issue I would like to raise, the second problem or obstacle I would like to raise, and that is bureaucratic red tape. We need to cut red tape and streamline all planning and approval processes so that there is no undue delay in government approval processes. Currently, we know, Minister, approval processes take too long. I can share with you, having been Premier for only 3 years, and we have been working on some of the projects, PPP projects, that must be approved by our National Treasury. Of course, our National Treasury must ensure that there's prudence, there's value for money, there's no corruption. But it takes too long for one single project to be approved. You go through too many phases, TI1, something, something, TI2, another something, something. I'm sure it's our experience in government everywhere. The private sector has no appetite to wait until we have taken 5 years just to approve projects. They will move on to the next place. They'll certainly move on to the next dispensation where approvals take quicker. And one of those dispensations we know is Rwanda, where things move faster, where red tape is an enemy of the state. We must make red tape the enemy of the state ourselves. If we want to attract private sector participation in these projects, we must make red tape the enemy of the state. And it is for this reason that we have established 2 cabinet committees. The first one is the Provincial Infrastructure Steering Committee, which I chair, whose main focus is to, firstly, to make sure that all preparations and technical readiness of our infrastructure projects happens as quickly as possible. There are no departments that hold us back. And then secondly, when the projects have reached technical readiness, we also monitor that they are delivered on time and on budget. infrastructure delays and budget cost overruns are also a known story everywhere. If things take too long, if it takes too long, take 10 years to deliver one hospital, by the time you deliver that hospital, it costs twice what it cost at the beginning. The second committee that we have also established is the Cutting Red Tape Committee, or task team led by MEC Paul Mashatile. We are combing through our whole system of provincial government. There are many things that government can do much quicker and much faster. But we are too satisfied with waiting and long extended periods. So MEC Mashatile has got a big X that he's been given to go and look throughout our system of government, including in municipalities, where we can completely cut red tape because a lot of things take much longer than they are required. So those two committees, the one that oversees the operationalization, the planning and delivery of infrastructure projects, and the other that looks at cutting red tape, are very important instruments to clear our province so that it is ripe for private sector investment in all the areas that I've referred to. The third area which we are working on as the provincial government, again, to make sure that Gauteng attracts investment, private sector investment, is to do with the issue of corruption. It is known all over the world, mega infrastructure projects, major infrastructure projects everywhere in the world are also prone for attracting corruption and bribery. So as a province, in addition to the introduction of the open tender system so that there's transparency and public probity about the awarding of tenders on all our infrastructure projects, we are also establishing a civil society-led watchdog committee, which I will announce publicly next week. And this civil society-led watchdog committee is going to watch over all our procurement processes, that there is no corruption, that they are clean, and is part of helping us to deliver on our dream of clean and ethical governance and leadership. Lastly, as part of creating a climate to attract private sector investors to our province, our provincial government has just approved last week a set of incentives, administrative and technical incentives, incentives for business expansion and retention in specific corridors of our province, incentives to support R&D, incentives to also support clusters and export development in different areas of our province, and lastly, incentives to attract businesses into the townships. So all these incentives are provincial and municipal incentives. They exclude the DTI incentives. So we don't have a lot of money, so we can't give money. We know that the DTI minister is able to incentivize sectors and industries and firms at a certain level. But we can do certain things at a provincial level through this provincial and municipal incentive schemes to attract business into our province. These incentives are very important. As I said, they were approved by our provincial cabinet last week, and they are going to be rolled in line with our provincial economic development plan for different sectors and different corridors, depending on what type of business we want to attract in which corridor of our province. So, ladies and gentlemen, Gauteng is ready for business, and Africa is ready for greater levels of inter-Africa trade and investment. Let us get down to business. Thank you very much. Asante sana.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Premier of the Gauteng Province, David Makura, being very frank about the state of affairs, highlighting the achievements that the province has realized, but also speaking very openly about the bottlenecks that still exist. And perhaps one of the key numbers that we need to walk away with from what we've heard from the Premier is that for every R1 invested, for every R1 spent, an additional 92 cents is attributed to the Gauteng economy. And as we reflect on those numbers, let's also reflect on another point that is made, that although the residents in Gauteng have pointed out general levels of satisfaction, if we look, for example, at water, there are real concerns around the cost and security of water sources in the future. And this underscores the very challenge of the conversations we're going to be having here today. How do we attract investors who are looking for a return in investment, but also meeting our social targets and making sure that the tariffs that are reflected from those investments are reflective of the social context from which our people come. And so lastly, as I call on the Minister of Economic Development, Minister, one of the things that we heard from the Premier is a cry for improving the efficiencies in the approval process of huge infrastructure projects. And in fact, I think the MEC referred to those infrastructure projects as both strategic and catalytic. I think the one thing we all don't want to see is MEC Mashetile using the big axe that has been referred to today. So to avoid the big axe, Minister, how do we ensure that we improve some of these operational and approval processes? Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the Minister of Economic Development, Minister Ibrahim Patel.
Premier David Makura, members of the Cabinet of Gauteng Province, executive mayors and councillors, leaders from the construction industry and state-owned companies, investors, leaders from organized labor, ambassadors, international guests, and particularly the delegation from the state of Lagos, delegates to the conference. Thank you, Premier, very warmly for the invitation to speak at the second conference on infrastructure investment in Gauteng. 2 years ago, Gauteng initiated this major dialogue, this gathering of people with money, people with ideas, people with need, people with labor, to see how through dialogue and discussion, you can enhance infrastructure delivery. It is the premier event of its kind in South Africa. And by way of illustrating the importance both of dialogue and of infrastructure, I want to start by telling you a story. It's a story of a man who came home one day to his house, which was in a complex, in a housing complex. And this man, as many Gautengers, was used to traveling widely in South Africa on business purposes. And as he sat down for dinner that evening, his phone buzzed. And he grabbed his phone, and it was an SMS. And the SMS said, "Dear sir, I am your neighbor, and I want to make a terrible confession, and I'm extremely sorry about what I'm about to tell you. Every time you have traveled away from Gauteng, I'm sorry to admit, I have been using your wife without your permission." Man, of course, was extremely upset about this. Unfortunately, grabbed a gun and shot at his wife. Next moment, the phone beeps again, and in anger and quite upset, he grabbed the phone. He sees it's another SMS. He clicks on the message, and it says, "It's your neighbor again. I'm really sorry. I meant Wi-Fi, not wife." Now, the lessons from that story is dialogue is important. The lesson from that story is accuracy is important. And perhaps the lesson from that story is don't steal your neighbor's Wi-Fi. And Premier Makura, perhaps the lesson for us in government is let's roll out connectivity very quickly. Now, it's fitting that you as Gauteng play this leading role in drawing together the many stakeholders on infrastructure. Because Gauteng is the industrial heart of the African continent. It's something that has been emphasized in the video that you saw earlier and in the address by the Premier of Gauteng. Your provincial gross domestic product today is estimated at about 1.5 trillion rand. You produce 1/3 of all the goods and services in South Africa every year. When we look at the industrial profile of our country, we classify all economic activities in 10 major economic sectors. Gauteng is the largest in 8 of those 10 sectors. You're the biggest in manufacturing, in business services, in government, in transport, in construction, in trade, in personal services, and in utilities. Gauteng is also a significant employer of labor. In March this year, Gauteng had about 5.2 million people who had a job, who were employed. And that is 1 out of 3 South Africans with a job. As your Premier remarked, had Gauteng been a country, it would have been the 5th largest economy on the African continent. Bigger than Angola, bigger than DRC, bigger than Kenya, and many other economies. But this economic powerhouse also has enormous challenges that it has to meet. 2.1 million unemployed people, the majority of whom are young. So today, we're really talking about infrastructure, and over 2 days, you'll be bringing together the best thinkers and leaders in the field in a series of panels to draw together key lessons and to identify what is it that you can do collectively. The relevance of me quoting to you the economic statistics and Gauteng's place in the South African economy, and indeed in the continental economy, is infrastructure is critical to economic performance. It's a requirement of modern competitive economies, economies that require energy and transport logistics and water and communication systems. But infrastructure is a spur to growth itself, adding goods and services to our GDP. Economists in my department and elsewhere can point you to the enormous economic multiplier of infrastructure. That when we invest in infrastructure, we do many things. We create demand for bricks and cement, of course, but also for project managers, for financiers, and it's a market for money, a demand market for money. And importantly, not only in the construction industry, but in the products that are produced, They enhance value in the economy. Aside from the economic story, Gauteng has 24% of the country's residents. If you lined all South Africans up, 1 out of 4 would be residents. Conference, the country has invested 551 billion rand in infrastructure. Indeed, had we not increased infrastructure spending over the last 10 years, the economy would have gone into recession in 2015. Just the additional spending in infrastructure, not the total infrastructure, just the additional spending we've been able to bring into the system over the last 8-9 years has added about 2.2% to the size of the national GDP. Brazil, Russia, Nigeria were all in recession last year. And we counted the reason why South Africa, also a commodity-producing country, had not got into recession was because of infrastructure spending. Since the last conference, Premier Makura, by way of a report back, let's look at what happened on energy generation. In the year of your conference, we began to have blackouts, energy shortages, and a real challenge to the economy because of a mismatch between energy demand and available supply. Over the 2-year period alone, we've been able to add through renewable energy and through parts of Medupi power station that has come onto grid, we've been able to add about 5,300 megawatts of additional energy. Now, what is 5,300 megawatts by way of an equivalent? It is about the consumption of electricity by all the residents of the 3 metros in Gauteng, all added together. The household electricity consumption of Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni added together is roughly the new energy capacity that we've brought on stream since the last conference. We've laid about 900 kilometers of transmission lines. These are these massive transmission towers and lines across the country. 900 kilometers is about the distance from Johannesburg to East London. So it's as if we've laid an entirely new transmission system between these two areas. Or for those with a more international bent, we've got some international guests. It's roughly the distance between London and the city of Milan in Italy. That's what we've been able to lay by way of transmission lines. Just short of 200,000 new houses have been built, and more than 500,000 houses since the last conference have been connected to the electricity grid. The country has built about 60 new clinics and 230 new schools. But infrastructure is not only about these physical platforms for growth, they're also about what you use on those platforms. So when we built the Ria Vaya, we required buses. When we integrated our public transport systems, we saw an opportunity to localize the manufacture of taxis. And as Transnet modernized its systems, it required more trains. And in the period since the last conference, 2,200 new train wagons have been manufactured here in South Africa. We're not talking here now of things done in Spain or Brazil or in China, but trains built in South Africa. We've been able to expand taxi production. So 24,000 minibus taxis have been manufactured here in South Africa. Some in Gauteng at a company called BAW, and others in KZN. And smartphone penetration has also gone up. The audience that sat here 2 years ago would have been part of a country where smartphone penetration was about 38%. Today you are part of a country where smartphone penetration is about 62%. In this period of 2 years, an enormous expansion of smartphones. And the value of smartphones is these little boxes are most South Africans' connection to the internet, to the enormous capacity that we have there. They access it through this telephone. Now, I've spoken a little bit about the physical products of infrastructure, but I wanted to share with delegates also some of the regulatory and other challenges in the infrastructure space. I have no doubt in the course of the conversation over the next few days, you'll be reflecting on a little bit of these. And let me start with the challenge of competition. The South African economy has been characterized by high levels of concentration, but also by pervasive misconduct, corporate misconduct in the form of cartels and price fixing. The Competition Commission over the last number of years have been working on opening up the economy, making it more competitive, combating cartels and price fixing, because they're a drag on economic growth and on social inclusion. And I want to cite two examples of it, both linked to infrastructure. The first example, delegates, is that of steel, which is absolutely fundamental to just about every part of infrastructure. The largest steel maker in South Africa is a company called ArcelorMittal. It's a global player. It makes steel globally, and it took over the assets of ISCO many, many years ago, and it has been producing steel. It's got an effective monopoly on certain types of steel that then goes into essentially each part of infrastructure. And the Competition Commission has been looking at the company conduct, identified challenges with collusion and abuse of dominance, and after a long investigation, last year we brought the discussions to a conclusion and reached a settlement agreement with the company in which it admitted certain acts of misconduct. It paid what was then the highest single corporate fine paid by one company, 1.5 billion rand. But it also agreed to a set of other elements in the settlement that were important. It agreed it would cap future steel prices for a period, and we worked out a formula linked to an international basket of prices, so that the South African economy is not held hostage to the fact that we have a monopoly upstream supplier of steel. It undertook also, among others, to transform its ownership and to give opportunities to black South Africans to come in as shareholders and to protect jobs in its factories. The important message that went out to the market is even the very large players will not be immune to scrutiny of their corporate conduct, that the state has built the capability and the capacity to pierce the corporate behavior that has very often been in the form of collusion, price fixing, market segmentation, abuse of dominance. And I think it sent a powerful message out there that we want to have a partnership with the private sector, but it's got to be a partnership based on a more dynamic set of corporate behaviors. But in turn, the company also came to the party. It said as part of the settlement, it wants to rebuild its competitive base, and it would do so through new investment. So ArcelorMittal is now committed to invest some 4.6 billion rand in modernizing steel making in South Africa, so that it's not reliant on breaches of the law to be able to maintain its market share. And that for me is a classic example of the kind of interventions the state needs to take to be able to ensure we have an efficient, well-run, competitive infrastructure component manufacturing sector. Since the last conference, we've also concluded a settlement agreement with the large construction companies. These construction companies had been found guilty of collusion in 2013, collusion involving Stadia and the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Program, the highway from Johannesburg to Pretoria. And after they had paid their fines, we sat down with the companies and we said, we need to build a new partnership. A partnership in which they compensate the state for any overpayment that we've had, but also in which they transform the ownership structures of the industry. So we went beyond the Competition Act and entered into a much wider transformation package with those companies. Today, Marion Roberts has announced that it sold 100% of its construction businesses to a black-owned consortium. Avenge is selling 45% of its shares to black investors. WBHO, Robex, and Stefanucci stocks will together support 7 black South African construction companies that over the next 7 years, those companies' turnover will be equal to 25% of the turnover of these three companies combined. And Group 5 and Basil Reed are finalizing a transformation plan and partners. So over the next number of years, we're going to see the shape of the construction sector changing, new entrants coming in, and many more opportunities for smaller players. Aside from the transformation we're doing on construction, we also recognize the importance of the suppliers to the industry. So the Industrial Development Corporation, the IDC, has begun to fund South Africans, black South Africans, to go into areas like foundries. We now have a large foundry that is owned and run by a black South African. In the manufacture of components that go into water systems and in electronic systems, train and coach refurbishing, and many other sectors. I identify these because they begin to answer the question, how do you use this enormous infrastructure spend to stimulate wider development in the economy? Gauteng itself has been ramping up its infrastructure spending. Since the last conference, the spending by the province and the municipalities in Gauteng equaled about 63 billion rand. And Premier Makura has given you a number of metrics of performance in Gauteng, and I'm going to really just underscore the importance that he has attached to those. But aside from the areas of the schools that we've built and the clinics and the power stations and the water pipelines and so on, there's also an importance of building industrial infrastructure. And let me illustrate this with an example, a recent example in Johannesburg. Last year in October, we launched a new film studio on top of the Carlton Center. And it's a state-of-the-art studio that would be able to enhance Joburg's offering as a major location for filmmaking. And it brings that infrastructure that would be utilized not only by South African producers, but also by production houses elsewhere on the continent. But the location of the Carlton Center, not Sandton, but the Carlton Center, is because part of what we do with infrastructure development is to rejuvenate inner city areas, to take areas where the market has begun to abandon it and to breathe new life into it. So that story illustrates the opportunity that there is with thoughtful, well-planned infrastructure interventions. While I've highlighted a number of successes, I also want to recognize big challenges that we have. Some of them are old challenges that we've not properly grasped, and others are new challenges. The first challenge that I want to speak to is that the economy has gone into recession. Our credit rating has been downgraded to sub-investment level. This credit downgrade is bad news for the economy, but it's also bad news for workers, for the urban and the rural poor, for the middle class. So we need a roadmap to get back into investment grade and to ensure that the recession is not prolonged and that we emerge as quickly from the recession with as little damage to the economy. How do we do that? There are four components to what we've identified as national government as the roadmap to get the economy going. The first is to develop a credible growth story, to identify areas in the economy with high growth potential that can absorb large numbers of young people, and to ensure that we overcome the obstacles to attract investment to those opportunities. The second one is to transform the economy, to make it more inclusive, to bring young people in, to bring black South Africans in, to bring women into the economy, to ensure that jobs are created and that we mainstream entrepreneurial and economic opportunities. The third one is to ensure integrity. integrity in government by taking firm steps against state capture and corruption, tender fraud, and to ensure that we manage our fiscal policies responsibly and sustainably, and that we inspire confidence in our people. And the fourth and final one is to deepen partnerships. To deepen partnerships with greater efforts to pursue a social compact between government, organized labor, the business community, and local communities. One of the other challenges that I want to identify is the challenge of urbanization. The migration of people from rural areas to cities, from small towns to bigger towns, and ultimately to the metropolitan centers is a global phenomenon. It has underpinned enormous global growth in productivity and economic advancement. Urbanization is a force for good. Urbanization is fundamental to the growth of modern, sophisticated economies. And cities are these great agglomerations of people, dense developments that connect human beings, that bring them together with factors of production, and that allows us to do many more things than we would be able to do if we were all rurally based. But when urbanization takes place at the speed that it does, it's disruptive. In Gauteng alone, you have net migration of about 100,000 additional people coming into Gauteng. This is the net effect after accounting for people who leave and people who come in. According to Statistics South Africa, every year, Gauteng has about 180,000 new households that are formed. These are both people coming into Gauteng, but also young people who get to the age where they leave the family home and they start up on their own. And when you think about that, 180,000 new households every year, that's an enormous challenge for electricity, water, housing, sanitation systems. And one of the opportunities that urbanization brings is to use densification, connecting people in much denser urban conglomerations as an opportunity. We've taken an unusual approach to urban development as South Africa, where we've gone for urban sprawl. Many other major cities in the world, large, wealthy, productive cities, are much more compact than we are. A couple of years ago, we showed the Premier of Gauteng, the then Premier of Gauteng, a map. We took a map of Gauteng, put it on a PowerPoint on a screen, and then we superimposed London on it. And we showed London and the population of London and how compact it was compared to the entire population of Gauteng. And we did the same thing with Jakarta, we did the same thing with Paris, to really make the point that urban dispersal, the movement away from the city centers, is very different to a global norm and a global trend. And it means that spatial geography is not the most efficient economic geography. So there's opportunities to rethink our urban development framework. Premier Makura and members of the Gauteng cabinet. A few months ago, I met with the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore. He had visited South Africa to attend the World Economic Forum. And I asked him about his impressions of South Africa. And the one thing that stood out for him is the difference between the Singapore model in residential development and the South African model. He emphasized mixed-use residential areas. The fact that the Singapore state very actively ensures that you have a model in which wealthier Singaporeans and less wealthy Singaporeans live in the same locality. We've moved into ones where the gap, the geographic gap between townships where poor South Africans live, suburbs and the gated communities where wealthier South Africans live, that distance has been enhanced, it's grown. And he made the point that there are economic benefits for Singapore through this mix model, but there's also enormous benefits for them in social cohesion. So urbanization reshapes Gauteng, and it provides the planners with an opportunity here to move away from the geography we inherited into the geography that we aspire to. A third challenge that I want to identify as important for national government, and I see you've picked it up in one of your discussions in panels, is the challenge of the fourth industrial revolution. The fourth industrial revolution is this profound shift in technology, the greater use of robotics, artificial intelligence, and networks, not only now for communication, people phoning each other or sending data to each other, but also connecting workplaces, connecting what is called the Internet of Things, household appliances, a fundamental shift in how society is working. It's beginning now and it's gathering pace. Its emblems are driverless cars, increasingly workerless factories, medical services that will become doctorless, legal services that will become lawyerless, where artificial intelligence begin to do not only that which human muscle used to do in the old days, turn widgets, but more importantly, what the human brain used to do. And the implication of the fourth industrial revolution for infrastructure is quite profound. I want to just cite two examples of it. The first example is that of the delivery of infrastructure itself. In the old paradigm, you built universities and students come to universities. With the fourth industrial revolution, you take these enormous learning capabilities that have been centralized in universities, and you make it available now on a much more decentralized basis. Electronic tutors instead of teachers. Access to a library that is bigger than the Wits library through the internet. The ability to work in groups through video conferencing. All of these is the shape really of the future. So when we begin to design infrastructure for the long term, we need to take into account this disruptive technology that's coming in here and that will reshape our infrastructure requirements themselves. But there's a second dimension to the fourth industrial revolution, and that's the centrality of communication and information systems. Fiber optic or whatever will replace it in future. The ability to ensure that people have access, digital access, those will become the passports and the currencies of tomorrow. And so when we have fiber optic systems that are inadequate for the volume of traffic that is coming through them, then we cut ourselves out of the major developments of the 21st century. If coal and oil were the driving forces of development in the 20th century, then data and access to data will become the driving force of economic development, growth, and opportunity in the 21st century. And it's in this context, therefore, that the question of data costs are absolutely central to economic development. I announced recently that we're using new provisions in the Competition Act to initiate a market inquiry into high data costs in South Africa. We're going to invite all of you to come forward when that market inquiry is held. We'll make sure that there is an open session in Gauteng, and we want businesses and government and young people and others to come forward and indicate the centrality of data to their lives and to the work that they do. Because we need a citizens' movement working with government to help bring data costs down. So that's a critical part of infrastructure development. Whereas we used to measure access to electricity as a key issue in the past. We've made enormous strides now on that front. Now it becomes access to reliable, cheap, and universally accessible data. I turn next to the challenge, Premier Makura and delegates, of the capacity of the state. It's an area you've highlighted with your absolutely spot-on comments on red tape. Infrastructure, if you think about it, is really managed by the public sector. The public sector plans for infrastructure. It can't subcontract the planning function to anyone else. It has to ensure the design of infrastructure meets social, policy, and other objectives. It's got to ensure that the specifications that are put out to the market are appropriate and fit for purpose. It has to negotiate the contracts even where we have private sector players that come in to produce the infrastructure. The state has to negotiate the terms of it. Very often the state has to mobilize the funding for the infrastructure, and it has to contract manage your private sector players when they begin to deliver the infrastructure. And when the infrastructure is handed over, it's the state that has to make the rules relating to the operation of that infrastructure, the maintenance of that infrastructure. In short, the state is absolutely critical. But the state hasn't consistently built the internal capacity to be able to carry out that important mandate. Your engineering core, your planners, your quantity surveyors, your people with financial structuring skills that would be able to move an infrastructure idea from conception to execution efficiently. Now, what is it that the state looks for? I want to identify the 4 big things for the state in managing that entire pipeline of delivery. The first issue is to get speed of delivery for the reasons that the Premier identified. The second is to get quality and fitness for purpose. You can't buy a train that doesn't fit on South African rail. You've got to get price right to make sure that it's competitively priced, that the users who ultimately use that infrastructure are not charged too much. And you've got to maximize the development impact, the jobs, the empowerment of South Africans, the employment of young people, and so on. And in each of these areas, we have seen that the demand for the services in the state has stripped our internal capability. So what we've done now, very recently, from April this year, we managed to get a little bit of seed funding from National Treasury to develop the country's first technical project management unit. It's a unit that's going to sit above any single state-owned company. And it's going to begin to collect a group of South African engineers and planners and quantity surveyors and others that would be able to take an example like the one your Premier has given, where there's enormous and unduly delays, and say, we're bringing the technical skills. If the city of Joburg is not issuing the right licenses, or if the National Department of Water and Sanitation is not issuing the water licenses, here is a team of people inside the state whose job it is to unblock, to be the person, the grouping, the entity that can make sure that we move much quicker to get infrastructure built. And we do this because we recognize that the slow speed of infrastructure is not only bad for communities, it's also bad for the economy. When you plan on spending R1 billion and you delay that spending, it has an enormous impact on economic performance. The next challenge that I want to identify in infrastructure delivery is what I call, for want of a better word, the challenge of leakage. And by leakage, I mean the kind of things that dampen the impact of infrastructure investment on the economy. So your discussion will be, how do we get many billions more rands into infrastructure? And I think that's an important discussion, but I want to make the argument that it's not a sufficient discussion. That absent action in other areas, billions of rands flowing in at the top into infrastructure will not have the effect that we seek to have. And the leakages that I refer specifically to are the leakages of overspending, the leakage of corruption, the leakage of imports of components, the leakage of cable and metal theft, and the leakage of disruptions caused by either community protests or other disruptions where local players are unhappy with the decisions we've taken. We've done considerable work in each of these areas of leakage. In the area of overspending, for example, we've taken a number of major projects of the state. We've looked at what the original budgets were and what the final payments were. And there are enormous gaps. In some cases, we are paying more than 100% the budgeted amount for that infrastructure. And what that means is we're getting half of the value of the infrastructure that we originally intended. If we've done a feasibility study saying that a project is 10 billion rand, and these are the economic benefits that flow from it, if that project is 20 billion rand, you're effectively getting half the value for the money that you had planned originally. So that's a leakage that we've got to deal with. And part of that leakage is capability challenges in the state, where we overpay, we don't plan well, our specifications are wrong, and we do changes to work specs when the project is underway. The second one is corruption. Corruption organized on a grand scale essentially siphons money that should go into infrastructure into private pockets improperly. And we've done a bit of modeling to look at the impact of infrastructure or the effect of corruption on infrastructure. Imports, I've referred to this previously with the example of the trains. Cable and metal theft is a very significant challenge. You can spend all the money on the Gauteng. If there's downtime on the Gauteng because cable is stolen, or if hospitals, a section of a hospital is not being used because metal or cable connected to the hospital has been stolen, or metro rail is unable to operate because metal and cable has been stolen, it doesn't matter how much money you put in. You debilitate your systems through these things. And finally, the question of community disruption is very evident. So what we've done is we've said, if we overpay 10% on the infrastructure program, either because of poor technical capability in the state or due to corruption, then that would amount to a 27 billion rand loss annually in the economy. And it would mean 76,000 jobs that could have been created are not created as a result of that spending. So the action, the mobilization of public opinion against corruption is a critical part of making our infrastructure program work. And it's not only to ensure that we stop future corruption, but it's also ensuring that the public purse gets back every cent that has been corruptly paid over to any person or any contractor. Finally, let me come to the issue of some of the opportunities. Having identified what I've really been able to do is to give you a few examples of some of the challenges. And so similarly, I want to give a few examples of opportunities that I have no doubt you will be talking about over the next 2 days. The first opportunity lies in Gauteng province's own infrastructure spend. If we take simply provincial spend and metro spend and the local municipality spend, excluding what national government does in the province, then over the next 5 years, we estimate that Gauteng will be spending anything from 150 billion to 200 billion rand. Now that spending has the opportunity to create a large number of jobs, to stimulate local economic development through the components that can be made for your infrastructure, and in creating communities, livable communities through the integration of residential areas and others. If we had the gift of 150 billion rand to 200 billion rand, how would we secure the best return to that, the best social return? As investors, you will be looking at the economic return, the commercial return, rightly so. As society and as government, we're going to be looking at the development return. And so one of the opportunities lies in a little bit of forward planning to see how do we use the output of Gauteng's colleges and universities off the back of this enormous infrastructure program that you will be involved in. How to turn infrastructure into a learning space where young people coming out of the TVET colleges and the universities are connected to infrastructure in the province. The second opportunity is to leverage investment from the private sector. The very existence of competitive, modern, sophisticated infrastructure is a magnet for investment. Last year, the IDC approved 5 billion rands worth of new investment in Gauteng. That alone will create about 7,000 jobs, create or save about 7,000 jobs in the province. And by the way, a big chunk of this money, almost 2 billion rand, has been for projects that are run by black industrialists. So we're open to looking at how development finance institutions like the IDC can be a partner to the Gauteng government and to the investment community off the back of this enormous investment in infrastructure. What do we need to do to support new component manufacturers that will be able to produce the inputs into infrastructure? And we can bring quite competitive priced funding packages to this equation. The third one is Gauteng's role as a hub of services and finance. The heart of the South African capital markets and financial systems is in Gauteng. So where infrastructure development takes place in KwaZulu-Natal or Eastern Cape or Western Cape, the structuring of it is essentially a Sandton function. And increasingly, as more and more of the infrastructure gap on the rest of the continent is addressed, that structuring of funding, that raising of funding itself can happen in South African capital markets. Premier, you pointed to the $100 billion gap in infrastructure spending on the continent. That's about 1.5 trillion rand annually. The sum of money that the African continent needs to invest in infrastructure to be able to unlock its economic opportunities. And Gauteng, if you think about where will the civil engineers and the financiers and the project managers come from, they sit in this room. Years back, like many of you, when I visited Gulf Arab states to talk about increasing trade with South Africa, the one thing that is prominent is the use of South African construction companies in those fast-growing economies. The new opportunity lies on our continent itself, in countries that are our neighbors and stretching as far as Nigeria, Egypt, Libya, and others. And so, Premier Makura, the step you've taken to develop a partnership with the state of Lagos, I think is very timely, is very appropriate, because we're going to have to develop these partnerships to enable Nigerian companies, South African companies, to grab the opportunity on the continent. It's Africa's moment. It's Africa's moment. In a previous century, it was Europe and the United States that secured enormous fuel from the opportunities on the African continent for their economies. More latterly, many other parts of the world, China and others, have deepened their relationships with the African continent. We want to remain open to the rest of the world, to North America, to Europe, to China, to India, to Brazil. But it's Africa's responsibility to seize the moment of investment in infrastructure to build African manufacturing capability, to industrialize the continent, to take the fact that we are a rapidly urbanizing continent with still fast growth rates, a young population, an enormous natural resource base of gas and oil and minerals, huge agricultural areas that have been untapped. Infrastructure is the artery, the thing that connects all of that, and that opportunity lies there for us as Africans. Let's seize it. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, a thorough overview and reflection of the state of infrastructure investment in South Africa, some global best practice, some continental best practice to look at. And certainly, Minister, thank you for the challenges that you've also put at our feet. And one of those, of course, being to rethink our spatial development so that it more accurately reflects our social ambitions as well. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings to an end our official opening ceremony. I'd like to thank the Minister of Economic Development, to thank the Premier of the Gauteng Province, and to thank the MEC for Economic Development for the official opening. We're going to transition now into our panel discussions, but perhaps a final round of applause for our opening ceremony speakers. Thank you.
Gauteng, South Africa's economic powerhouse, leads the way in investment, manufacturing, technology, research and innovation. 5 regions seamlessly collaborate to form a harmonious economic relationship, making Gauteng an integrated city region. Gauteng contributes 34% of South Africa's GDP, as well as 10% to Africa's GDP. The provincial economy attracts the largest share of South Africa's FDI inflows and also accounts for the largest exports. Most multinational companies doing business in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa have their headquarters in Gauteng and call it their home. All major financial and telecommunication companies are based in Gauteng. Gauteng boasts a modern transport infrastructure in which air, rail and road effortlessly connect, making it the gateway to Africa. It is home to Africa's largest and busiest airport, the OR Tambo International Airport. Despite being landlocked, Gauteng prides itself in having the largest inland port in Africa, making it the continent's pulse of connectivity. Pursuant to its commitment towards radical transformation, modernization and reindustrialization, Gauteng is experiencing major spatial and economic transformation. A new economic plan aims to increase employment and economic inclusion by focusing on the following key sectors: manufacturing, services, mining, agriculture, infrastructure development, creative and cultural industries. Research and development has a crucial role in the growth of the economy. Gauteng boasts the highest concentration of research and academic institutions, bolstering its capacity for innovation. Gauteng's prowess and towering ambitions are also evident in its successful hosting of high-profile sporting, cultural and entertainment events. Gauteng is strategically poised to offer a unique hosting experience. Great moments are staged here. Like leading city regions in the world, modern-day Gauteng is the melting pot of cultures. It is a place where people from all walks of life can celebrate their dreams and realize their ambitions. This is a place where people live, work, and play. Gauteng.
Stated amongst others that investing in sustainable and resilient infrastructure, including transport, energy, water, and sanitation for all, is a prerequisite for the achievement of the post-2015 Global Development Goals. As the United Cities and local governments, we also have what we call GOLD, which is the Global Observatory on Democracy and Decentralization. And at this observatory, we publish a regular document that we call the GOLD Report. The recent GOLD 4 report of the UCLG indicates, amongst others, that it is important that as we implement our program towards Agenda 2030, that we realize that infrastructure would be a critical prerequisite for the achievement of the Global Development Goals. We further acknowledge that the current model of financing infrastructure does not respond to the needs of the most needy cities and regions across the globe. Yet this does not suggest that, in fact, there isn't financing for infrastructure. It is the dichotomy about infrastructure funding at a global level, where there is excess financing globally for infrastructure financing, yet there are gaps in the global south. Furthermore, there is recognition that most cities and towns in least developed countries and in middle-income countries would continue to suffer from an investment strike, even if green and new avenues for infrastructure financing opens up. It is thus that we have sought to find responses to this, to address infrastructure funding needs for cities in the global south and Africa in particular. And one of the critical issues with regards to this relates to the ability to create the necessary capacity, both of the cities and regions themselves, but also of the international institutions and agencies to support infrastructure financing. In this regard, as the presidency of UCLG, we're establishing a sustainable infrastructure finance think tank that is composed of international advisors and institutions to advise on how best to structure mechanisms to enable access to global funding. And this will be presented to the World Council of UCLG at the end of this year. Furthermore, we're working with Metropolis, of which our Premier is co-president, to restructure one of the critical agencies that have been established internationally called FMDV, which is the Global Fund for City Development, to see how this can more effectively create access to infrastructure financing for cities in the global south, but for cities throughout the world, but with a particular bias to the global south. I think I should indicate in this regard that when the FMDV was originally conceptualized, it was conceptualized as a World Bank of local government. It has evolved over time, and there's been an acknowledgement that it would be rather futile for local government to establish its own multilateral development agency, and that would have to work with existing multilateral development financing agencies to ensure access to financing. But what we are now doing is to ensure that through FMDV, we create better mechanisms for cities to access financing. What should be recognized is that for local government, the resource envelope will not meet our development needs. if you take into account what the minister has just raised, we have to accept that whilst we can invest in infrastructure and we leverage the balance sheets of our respective municipalities, if you take into account urbanization and backlogs and other pressures to infrastructure needs in our cities, the reality is that the investment is going to fall short of the actual need. So we need to significantly increase what we invest in and mechanisms for that financing. So we have identified a number of critical issues that need to be considered with regards to funding instruments that should be created to address this gap. And some of these include, amongst others, the realization that whilst as a middle-income country, many middle-income countries would be receiving less donor funding, that access to donor funding for local and regional governments is increasing even in middle-income countries. It's going to be critical for those of us involved in the space of local and regional governments to ensure that we're able to shape our institutions to be able to access these models of financing. It historically has not been the arena of local and regional governments to access financing from the global donor community. Yet this is something that we have to brace ourselves, particularly as such funding is decreasing for sovereign. It's also important that as we go towards 2020 and the new climate funding arrangements, that we are also able to prepare our institutions to be able to access climate change financing. And in many ways accept that climate change financing deals with the critical issues that we deal with at a local level, both at the level of adaptation and also at the level of mitigation. And without getting into the detail of what that is about, adaptation is about ensuring that we're able to invest in infrastructure to be resilient to the changes that are brought about by climate change. So our stormwater attenuation systems need to receive reinvestment and expanded to accept the new challenges that we're confronting. And at the level of mitigation, it's about, amongst others, investing in energy, alternative energy sources, so that we reduce the impact on the environment and climate change. So these are new instruments that we need to access and create capabilities and capacity to access these instruments, particularly with the new regime that is coming on stream post-2020. But this requires that as a country, we rethink the way in which we enable our local authorities to access financing. Because many of these instruments are subject to national government providing the necessary framework for local government and regional government to access such models of financing. So we'll need to revise legislation in the country to enable local and regional governments in the country to access such financing mechanisms. We'll also need to review the way in which we limit the ability in particular of local government to leverage not only its balance sheet to get into the debt capital markets, but also to ensure that they are able to utilize grant funding, particularly capital grants, to be able to finance infrastructure. So right now, municipalities are limited to utilizing their own income and operating grants, but not the capital grants that they receive from national government. If you can include the capital grants as a mechanism of ensuring that local government can access the debt capital market, we're increasing the capability of our local authorities to be able to access such funding. Of course, we need to ensure that the framework created is not that we're going to utilize borrowed money to borrow more money. So the system itself would need to be designed in such a way that it mitigates against imprudent ways of raising financing for local government in this regard. The next area that I think is important and has been identified by the Premier is with regards to public-private partnerships. The regime for public-private partnerships in the country limits the capability of local authorities and provincial governments and departments and state-owned entities to enter into public-private partnerships. So we need to review the regime without compromising the fiscus of the country. So we need a fair balance, taking into account that the private sector can easily run away with the sort of agreements that can be entered into if there isn't the necessary checks and balances. That, however, shouldn't stop us from trying to find ways of ensuring that we reduce the red tape to access public-private partnerships by local and regional governments and by our province in particular. As indicated earlier, local government itself is exploring new and innovative financing instruments, and these include, amongst others, pooled financing mechanisms that we've utilized FMDV as an advisor on. So we've worked with the South African Local Government Association, the Gauteng Provincial Government, and National Treasury to see if we can pull together the municipalities to raise common bonds in areas where they have common interests, so they can raise one instrument, particularly for those municipalities that are unable to access the debt capital markets. And this could be to address challenges such as water, sanitation, and other areas where we think there would be common needs for the province of Gauteng. So to finance or co-finance, amongst others, let's say a major sanitation plant that services multiple municipalities, you could be able to use pooled financing mechanisms as a mechanism through which local authorities can jointly raise and access the debt capital markets. And we're also investigating social impact bonds and other financial instruments to be accessed by local authorities. In conclusion, our reality as South Africa and the Global South in particular, but particularly in Africa, we have not accessed the instruments that are available, partly because of limitations on our side, but also because of the bureaucracies on the other side. If you look at a map that talks about climate financing, the reality is that the bulk of climate financing has gone to the global north. And if you look at the map in Africa of who has accessed climate financing, in fact, you would see one single little dot somewhere in South Africa for the whole of Africa. So the adequacy through which we've been able to access this has been limited. But also the reality that we need to now prepare ourselves to access donor funding that is shifting from national and sovereign governments, but is becoming available to local governments, is something that we need to explore quite seriously, because it's not an arena in which we have operated historically, but sovereign has operated there. So national government historically has gone to the EU to raise donor funding. But EU funding is drying up for the country over the next year or two. But the EU has said we're available to finance local and regional government, so we can provide donor funding for local and regional government. So we need to gear our systems to be able to take advantage of that. To achieve this, we also need partnerships with stakeholders and all spheres of government, including the private sector. But we must collectively address the funding framework through innovation, reform, and collaboration. This also means that we need to look actively into the funding instruments available internationally, including the multilateral development funding agencies. And in this regard, we include the new BRICS Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and other multilateral development financing institutions that are available to be able to access financing to close the gap. Because, as I indicated, there isn't a lack of money. In fact, there is excess financing for infrastructure available globally. Yet there is a gap in financing infrastructure in Africa and in the global south. So we need to find ways of closing that gap so that we can take advantage of funding instruments locally. And when I say locally, I'm talking about South Africa, but also take advantage of the opportunities available internationally and in the multilateral financial development institutions overall. Thank you very much.
That's a very big thank you to Councillor Parkstar. We're going to turn our focus now to the panel, to giving them an opportunity to respond to some of the issues and some of the themes that Councillor Parkstar has put onto the table. And ladies and gentlemen, as indicated, we're going to be bringing your voices into the conversation as well. So we're going to be turning to you for questions and comments in a short while. But first, let me start on the far end. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Muvevi. A number of themes that were raised here today, one of those being the conundrum in terms of the excess funding that does exist versus the infrastructure financing gap that exists in the South. Councillor Parkstar spoke about trends in donor funding and whether we are poised to tap into those opportunities. He spoke a lot about legislation that doesn't speak to the needs of infrastructure investment. He spoke about local government being able to leverage and tap into their balance sheets so that they can tap into the capital markets. And one of the key things I think we also need to reflect on is the regime of public-private partnerships and whether that is still relevant in its current form for infrastructure financing. Let me give you an opportunity, just a minute or so on some of the key themes that have stuck out for you and any responses to those.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Technical team, please, let's make sure that everybody is audible. Thank you very much. Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Nozibo. I think let me start by, just introducing GPF, Gauteng Partnership Fund. We fall under human settlements as a delivery agent of human settlements. We have recently been given the mandate to look at mega projects. The mega projects that the Premier alluded to, the 12 mega projects, Gauteng Partnership Fund will be delivering those as an implementing agent. Our role is to raise funding for those mega projects. In addition to the funding that is available from government, is to leverage private sector funding. I understand there's about 95 investors, potential investors, that are as part of this conference in terms of the statistics in the brochure. So we're looking forward to really engaging with those investors pertaining to mega projects. Our role has always been to translate government's plans or government intentions in terms of projects and talking to private sector in terms of understanding the risks and being able to mitigate those risks for them to participate in the projects. I do agree that there is funding. I think post the summit that we hosted about a month or two ago, we've had quite a few inquiries of people indicating a willingness to invest in some of these social infrastructure projects. From what I see, it's always been the readiness of the projects or the bankability of the projects, the return on investment that investors expect. I think that is the biggest challenge that I've seen in terms of some of the projects that we've seen, that the projects need to be able to show a return to those investors and be able to be ready for them to be implemented. In most instances, some of the projects that we say are ready still have got challenges. So I think the planning issues are where we need to focus to make sure that those projects we plan properly to make sure that they're technically ready and are also financially feasible for investors to participate. So I do agree. I think that's one point that I agree. In terms of partnerships, triple Ps in the traditional sense, from Gauteng Partnership Fund, what we've seen is that they tend to take long. I think by virtue of the process that we have to go through as set out by legislation and Treasury. The partnerships that we've formed, and I can cite a few examples, are more outside the traditional triple P. An example would be your brick fields in housing in the inner city of Newtown, which was a catalyst of the development of that entire area. We had to bring in ABSA. At the time, I used to be with ABSA, so we funded that project. So we invested equity as well as debt into that project. GPF was part of a government institution that also put quasi-equity into that project, and Gauteng Human Settlement or Housing at the time also put in subsidies. So it's those sort of partnerships or projects that we have been involved in terms of private leverage of finance. Yeah.
So I just want to push you on that before I move on, because what I'm hearing is that the traditional model of public-private partnerships isn't quite ideal, and one of the points you raise is that the process takes too long. And in the process of that, innovatively, there have been projects that have been formed outside of the PPP framework. If the PPP framework had to be adjusted, whether it's on the legislative front, whether it's on the structuring of the deals, what do you think needs to change to ensure that PPPs remain the key vehicle that can attract investment into infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the principle really is to attract private sector. And from what I understand is that the triple P is really to make sure that there's a framework. The framework that people or institutions adhere to in implementing a project. I think those principles still need to be there, but it's just the process in which we're able to register projects, and we need to be able to take them through that entire process. So I wouldn't call it red tape, but I think it's cutting out certain steps that are more, I don't want to say unnecessary, but we need to review that process. We need to review that process so that it at least allows us to do some of these partnerships in a much quicker.
So we're back to efficiencies, and you've raised the point about bankability perhaps being the issue, and the planning and the preparation of projects being something that we need to focus on. Let me come to you, Mr. Naidu, and again, let me give you a quick opportunity to reflect on some of the things that have resonated strongly with you from what we heard from Councillor Dow.
Yes, thanks very much. I think the point was that there are funds available. In fact, there are lots of funds available. It's just the partnerships that have to be formed that can then bring those funds into a funding framework, a financial framework. Because from the private sector perspective, you are coming in for projects which have higher returns and lower risk, right, so on the back end. For some programs, green infrastructure, like we were discussing earlier, there are a lot of risks in the projects, new technologies, and the private companies wouldn't want to come in unless there was some de-risking that's already happened, and there's some commitment to a longer term. And one of the things with the public-private partnerships as well is the state can only go within a medium-term framework, 3 years, and so these are much longer-term projects. So then you have to look at saying, all right, if you're coming into that project, how would we then blend in other funding for the more high-risk parts? Maybe that's where the government comes in and the donors, like Councillor Tau was talking about. And then between the government and the donor and the private sector, that's where your dual mandate institutions like the Development Bank and all the rest, which are both commercial but also developmental, sort of concessional funds, comes in. But they have to come into a package, and they know we will come in when this phase is finished, and obviously, depending on the amount of risk the private sector takes, they will be able to share more of the upside. But I think that's always the issue. And I think a big part of it has been for the partnerships. If the different stakeholders don't understand the constraints of their counterparty, you can't put it together. So if you are waiting for private sector to come in on a high-risk program and you want them to come in at a low price, you are obviously fooling yourself. But if you know, at this point, we're going to bring you in, but this is on the terms on which we'll bring you in, because now we have taken some of the risk out of the business, that becomes more viable. So I think internationally, because we are not unique in facing these conditions, there are about 5 things that really have to be done for all big infrastructure programs. And so these will be, for example, you need to, so let's say as a province, have a long-term plan, at least 10 years, in terms of what are the strategic things you want to do. Okay. You need to have then identified what are the high-impact projects that you need to do to give rise to that vision in practice. You need to then have someone who's going to give that strong leadership to drive the program, and I think this province is not short of that. And as I think the 4th is then you have to look at the different, as Councillor Tau was saying, the different financial instruments you will bring in. Because some of the instruments are for the sort of demonstration early stage, some of the instruments are to help you deploy, and some of the instruments will be things that will help you spread that project out and make it diffuse. And then, you also need to be able to let the partners find each other. They don't all have to be led by the government.
Right.
You just need to say, this is what we want, and then create the sort of the environment for them to find each other. So I think that's just the international thing. And, from my own experience, and just listening to the councillor, there's essentially 3 things that become very, very important for Gauteng to do. And I'm sure between everyone in the room and sitting on this panel, to the left and right to me, already doing aspects of it. But, but 7 years ago, I led the DBSA team, Development Bank team, and we set up the South African Green Fund. And what we did with the South African Green Fund, it was really a prototype early stage funder. So many of the renewable projects and so on drew that money and made some parts of the REAP and so on quite viable. That fund has now been replenished twice, and I see it's now come to a point where it has to be replenished again.
Right.
But from a provincial perspective, however it's done, that sort of funding instrument is very important to unlock, unlock private sector.
Prototype funding.
Yeah. So to actually de-risk a lot of the projects. The second thing, which I was also involved in, I'm just reflecting things I know personally, was when the Western Cape set up an economic development partnership. And what they found is you can have the funding, but you have to get the stakeholders together to focus on the right projects. And you have to hear what their real issues are. Because otherwise you might think they're on strike, but they're not on strike, they're just being prudent.
Yeah.
They're not allowed by their board to take certain risks and so on. So Essential is looking at jointly identifying key programs and then how you build that platform, how you make everyone understand what needs to be done, how you monitor. And I think the Western Cape has done very well in terms of that. Gauteng has aspects of it, including this conference, which obviously is towards that. But that was done, I think, by an independent non-profit that was co-funded by the private sector and the government. So it was able to really knock heads together. I think that was second thing. The third thing which I think Gauteng is doing, which is better than any other province, and I've seen it in the SEPO 1 million program for youth, is to really bring the stakeholders together so that they themselves are actually interacting 365 days a year, 24/7, but they are finding projects. So for instance, let's say a big corporate wants to develop suppliers, but they don't have the money. Then the funding institutions are in the same program dealing with them. But the funding institutions would only come in when somebody is helping with the business development support. So there's a third partner has that funding. But once you put the business development support people together with the funders, suddenly the corporate can unlock the offtake agreement.
Yeah.
So I think it's the same thing translates to infrastructure. The funds are there, the partnerships just need to be structured in a way that it then begins to flow.
So again, getting to the heart of the partnerships, but most importantly, what I'm hearing is the approach to risk sharing and co-funding being fundamental to actually get these strategic and catalytic infrastructure projects moving. And we'll come back to some of the points that you've raised, like early stage funding and other ways that you can reduce the initial risk going into a project. But Mr. Siabi, again, let me give you an opportunity to very briefly just give us a high-level resonance in terms of what you've heard from the councillor.
Thank you. I think I'll just really mention the key theme that's coming through this conference, that we need to invest in infrastructure through partnership. And that came through what the MEC of the ED said, the Premier, and also the Minister. Really, Ravi, what's happening, if you had what the Premier said and the MEC said, is that in Gauteng we have the Gauteng Integrated Infrastructure Master Plan. It's a 30-year, it's a 15-year horizon. Really, what it brings out is that we have a pipeline of projects, key projects have been identified that needs to be implemented in that 15 years. They also, both the Premier and the MEC mentioned that there's almost about a 1.8 trillion that needs to be invested in that period. How do we do that? That can be only done through partnership. There's a need between government and private sector to be able to come together and bring that partnership to reality. And how do we do it? What government should do to ensure that that partnership becomes realized? First thing is that we need to be able to spend money as government on project development or project scoping. We need to be able to say, if this project that we want to roll out in the province, how do we roll that project out? What is the cost of that project, and what does it entail? So that's the first thing. The second issue is that we need to look at the framework, the framework of saying, we need to be able to get a structure that, let's structure this project in a manner that it really is palatable to professors to come and invest with government. And that happens when you are scoping the project. You need to be able to ensure that at an early stage, you look at the issues that the professor will be interested in investing in the project, and ensure that that specific project takes those issues into account, so that when you inviting professors to come and invest, they know and they are comfortable with investing in that project. The issue of P, really, I think the issue, negativity about it is the issue of time. The time is the issue, but private sector, they're comfortable with it. It gives them the comfort. They know what to expect in the P. P. What we should look at is how do you use the same framework and look at non-regulated P. So we look at the mechanism that there shouldn't be guarantees, because professors will look at guarantees. How do we ensure that the same framework comes into play in terms of infrastructure development, but we don't have guarantees? So that's the instrument that we need to be able to look at. I think the challenges that the minister raised around the economic not performing well, the issue of credit downgrade are the issues that we have to grapple with in this environment. What the councillor touched on is the issue of instruments. I think he went into length in terms of instruments that are available that we could look at. The P is still there. Yeah. We should look at it, but we should supposed to look at the time, in terms of reducing time. The issue of the private partnerships is also a mechanism that could be able to be applied. Here we look at a really government playing a role as a facilitator, creating an environment where private can come in and invest and make their own money. We can also use government asset like land as a leverage point to ensure that we attract professors to come and work with government. The issue of, I think, the pooling of grants, the issue of bonds, those are a type of opportunity that could be to apply to ensure that investment is happening in the province.
So a number of issues that you've raised there, some of them reinforcing what we've heard, but again, you're tapping into the instruments and you're saying, and this is what I'm hearing, that we need to think critically about the kind of financing instruments that we're tapping into, and this idea that's been put on the table that municipalities can actually pool their financing and look at common bonds and common grants is something that probably could move us forward. We'll interrogate the practicality of that in a moment. Mr. Smith, very briefly, again, what has resonated for you from the scoping of the conversation from the councillor, and that should at least then give us a bit of an opportunity to have a short conversation before we go to the audience. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I think just to identify who I represent, I was introduced as a Senior Policy Advisor of the Association for Savings and Investment South Africa. Who's that? We represent all the long-term life assurers, the Old Mutual, Sanlam, Liberty, etc., and also the asset management industry. So basically those people who manage the savings of the nation, the private sector funding, the private sector that everybody's wanting to go into partnership with. I also have a mandate from the Banking Association to work together with them in terms of working with the public sector to talk about what the Premier spoke about, help create the enabling environment for the private sector to engage with the public sector to help fund the infrastructure requirements of the country. We've been working on this now for over 5 years. I convened the ASISA Infrastructure Investment Work Group, where we've got all the participants in that space, members of that work group. And we report back to them on a regular basis as to our activities. What we've been doing in that space is working with National Treasury on a task team to help create this enabling environment. How do we get the private sector involved? What are the requirements for the private sector to get involved? And really at the heart of it is policy stability. Without that, it's going to be very difficult to get the private sector involved. That's why if we have a look at the success of the renewable program and what's been happening over the last year or so with Eskom refusing to sign the offtake agreements, that has put a spoke in the wheels of the further development of that program. 2 years ago, I attended a conference in Cape Town on the gas to power program that the Department of Energy was working on. Everybody was very enthusiastic, gung-ho about it. I attended the same conference, which is a worldwide conference this year. Everybody was downbeat because of this uncertainty of policy. So we need to ensure that that gets sorted out. I think also to have a look at the other areas that we've been involved in. We're involved with the National Treasury on urban finance, basically finding financing mechanisms for the metros. And Councillor Tar spoke about that, trying to see how can the private sector get more involved in funding, particularly the metros, so that the grant facilities that are available can go to those municipalities who are less able to fend for themselves. And I think if one has a look at the recent success of both the Ekurhuleni and City of Cape Town with their green bond coming to the bond market, which our members would have participated in, there's a lot of enthusiasm to participate in that. Both those issues were 4 times oversubscribed, which is indicative of the interest that our sector has in this market. Now, I think particularly if one says, well, why would the savings industry, the long-term industry, want to invest in infrastructure? It's basically, if you look at the nature of an infrastructure investment, that's long-term in nature, as well as the returns are linked to either CPI or GDP growth, which matches the liabilities of pension funds and life insurance policies very, very well. So therefore, for us, there's an economic need for us to want to, not only a need, but also a desire.
Right.
On which point, I just want to take exception to the Premier. He was saying that he wants to work with the private sector. They're looking for good returns, but they don't do it with good heart. We do it with good heart, I can promise you. Because at the end of the day, if it's good for the country, it's good for our members, who are individuals who are contributing to pension funds and policyholders. And I think maybe just last in terms of the activities that we're doing, we're beginning to work with some of the metros, particularly we've had engagements with the City of Johannesburg on saying how can the private sector get involved with them on water and sanitation by way of example. There are other examples, but maybe we can get back to that.
Absolutely, thank you for that. I'm going to come back to you and then populate the conversation based on some of the themes that have been raised. But one of the things that you've just mentioned, Audrey, is that long-term pension funds in particular, long-term investors are not only looking at the policy environment, but they're also looking at the performance of the economy. As we sit now, perhaps one of the key themes that has been raised today has been the technical recession, the technical recession, the technical recession. Now, to what extent does that then influence the appetite of long-term pension funds to participate and to invest in infrastructure?
At the end of the day, we're looking for investment opportunities. We're looking to broaden the horizon. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to get infrastructure investments as a separate asset class within the universe of investments for the savings industry. And if one says, well, how do we get ourselves out of this recession? We need to invest. Now the minister spoke about the state investing huge amounts of money, which enabled us to remain out of recession for longer than some of our international counterparts. And really one needs to continue with this. And one of our concerns certainly is how slow the pace of infrastructure investment is. If we go back to this conference 2 years ago, the province put forward a series of bankable projects. My question is, how many of those have actually been implemented? The Premier did talk about how slow these things are to develop. And I support him 100%. One needs to accelerate these, get rid of a lot of the red tape, not increase the risk by reducing that, but to make sure that these things do happen a lot more quickly.
I'm going to steal your question, and I'm going to throw it to you, Mr. Muveve, because the question has been recurrent. How do we then ensure that we're bringing in the efficiencies and we are increasing the output that allows for the approval of strategic infrastructure projects? Is there best practice example that we should be looking at on the continent, in the world as well? But the most important thing is, do we have the capacity as the state, as Minister had indicated, to actually ensure that we're able to prepare projects adequately so that the preparation stage and the preparation process is reduced significantly?
Yeah, I think it would vary from department to department or which sector. But generally, what I've seen is that investors are generally looking for government commitment. And you find in a triple P environment, government commitment is almost guaranteed. So on an overall, investors are looking for some kind of commitment in terms of budget and commitment in terms of payout.
Yeah.
So when you approve a project as a private sector investor, you want to commit money and make sure that when you do disperse, there's still money available from government to actually commit to that project. For me, that's the main important part when you compare triple P versus a normal. So when we're talking a hybrid, it's really about commitment. The other part that you've alluded to, I think as government, we should be looking at facilitating, creating a facilitation environment where we bring in private sector funding and being able to have structures that allow private sector participation. As government, we just need to commit a certain amount of funding that we have, but be more of a facilitator. To your question around, we need to make sure that when we engage in some of these projects, that we try and ensure that the environment that we create is not an environment in which we create more risk for the investors. And when we're saying that investors would like to participate, I think it's clear that investors would like to put in money in some of these projects. Yeah.
So I want to stay on the point of risk, and I want to bring it to you, Mr. Naidoo, and I'll come to you again, sir, because I think you raised the issue of development finance institutions. But let me come to Mr. Naidoo first. What I'm hearing is we have an early stage risk that is looked at. It's almost the risk is too high for the investor to get in. But if we link back to the point that was made by the minister as well, you have leakage risk. And that comes from, a number of issues, including corruption. So, in your view, how should we be thinking about de-risking the entire value chain of the infrastructure projects that we want to see come to life in the province?
I think there's a lot of transaction costs in putting a project together. I'm sure everyone in this room who's involved in it will know it takes a very long time. You put a lot of money at risk, waiting, hoping for the next part to fall into place, because you actually have to find the right projects with the right partners, with the right funding instruments at the right time.
Yeah.
There's a lot of moving parts, and you can spend a lot of time chasing your tail. So the sort of institutional facilitation that Bonnie is talking about becomes very, very important, because that massively reduces your transaction costs and your risk, because you don't have to spend a lot of time, 2 years, as a premise said, 5 years, and you may not get approval.
Right.
That's a lot of time and opportunity. So I think that's one of the things, and because we have created in South Africa a very complicated rule set. There's good reasons for it and all of that, but because it's very complicated, it also creates a perverse incentive. When you want to cut that time short, people then start doing very strange things.
I want to quickly just cut you, because I want to jump to the question of guarantees and whether development finance institutions, Mr. Siabi, are playing their role effectively in that space. Are we utilizing credit guarantees and sweating them to the best of our ability when we're looking at large-scale infrastructure projects?
Yeah. Maybe let me just also answer a question around project preparation. Especially in the province, GIFA, where I come from, is created primarily to spend money on project preparation. And really is to address the issue that Ravi is raising. So let's look at addressing the project. Make sure that the project, before it gets into implementation, that all the risk has been looked at and all the implications customers have been addressed, to ensure that these are the issues that will have to be addressed before the project gets into implementation. And the issue that the minister raised around leakages, that around time overrun, is some of the things that gets addressed in the project preparation.
Right.
So there is a fund created within the province.
Can we do better?
Yeah.
Can we do better?
We can do better. We can do better. There's still a long way to go in terms of improving that. So in terms of DFIs, the DBSA, we have signed as province signed an MOU with DBSA as well as PIC, really to invest, to co-invest in project preparation. They have the right to be able to say, after they invest in project, they also have the right to be able to participate in the implementation, in terms of funding for implementation. So it's something that is really in infancy stage, but we're seeing that we are moving in the right directions. We have a pipeline of about 25 projects currently that are working on at a value of about 40 billion. And we expect that in the next 2 years, those projects will have been at implementation stage.
Right.
And it is through partnership that we're working with Professor that we'll see those projects get implemented.
And is 2 years reflective of, where does 2 years sit in terms of the global standard, in terms of the time it takes to prepare a project?
Look, what I just mentioned is that we have worked on this project. We already prepared them. We have taken 6 projects to the market. We are taking 8 this year, and we expect to take another 8 next year to the market. So those are projects that we think that by the next 2 years will have come in implementation.
Right.
And as I said earlier, there's a pipeline of projects over these 15 years that we still have to work on to reach that 1.6 trillion rands that needs to be addressed. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to keep the panelists to myself. The conversation is robust and very thought-provoking, and I'm loving the fact that we're playing on the numbers, and so we're chasing hard metrics in terms of making sure that we're actually headed in the right direction. I'm going to open up to a short round of questions and answers. I am mindful of the fact that we are running behind schedule in terms of our program, and I'm wanting to make sure that we get back onto that particular well as schedule. Let me please get an indication by raising your hand if you would like to ask a question. And we will give you the opportunity to do so. There are roving mics that have been made available. Because of where we're sitting, I'm kindly going to request that you please stand and introduce yourself and also indicate to whom you'd like to ask your question, and we will ensure that the panelists that you've selected responds to that question, even if there might be other inputs from other panelists. Are there any questions from the floor? Are there any questions? There is a bright light, so I do see the gentleman standing over there. Sir, please remain standing as we take the microphone over to you. Is there an additional question before I close this round of questions? Okay, I see another hand over there, and we'll get to you. I do apologize for the lack of sight, so I know there's a person there. I can't make out if it's a sir or a madam. Sir, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Oscar from Joy Mineral Trading and Exchange. My question is going to all the panels. How can we develop the entrepreneurship in Africa so that we can increase growth? As the studies that be indicated that through increase of entrepreneurs, we can bridge the gap between the poor and the rich. How do we fast track in that space? Because in Africa there's a lot of who are more importers than manufacturers than exporters, so that we can export lots of goods so that we can increase our GDP.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Thank you for that. Short and sharp and to the point. I see the hand on my left-hand side. Please, can we get the microphone? May I kindly ask you to stand so that the microphone can come to you quickly? Thank you very much. Microphone making its way over. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question is referred to our Honorable Minister, Ibrahim Patel. We are getting different messages from the same government. We are talking about economic development and economic transformation. There is a proposal by the Minister of Mineral to invoke Section 49 of the MPRD, Mineral Petroleum Resource Development Act, and the moratorium on Section 11 on the MPRD. This has a negative impact in the infrastructure development and economic development. There will be no economic transformation if we prohibit the application of the prospecting rights, and also Section 11, which talks about the transfer of shares from one company to the other company, like when we dilute a Lillywhite company. So, Minister, when moratorium is going to be taken by Cabinet, I would like to appeal to you that we shouldn't support the moratorium which will prohibit economic development, which will no longer have benefit